We want to talk today about the origins and development of Australian environmental public policy in the Whitlam years and the very central contributions you made to those developments. That's a story that's going to take us via the United States, Stockholm, Canberra, PNG and Adelaide. But before we get there, it'd be good for you to tell us a little bit about your background, your education and also your early involvement in the Labor Party as well.
Well, thanks. Lovely to be here, first of all. When I was going to school in Wagga, I grew up in a regional city on the edge of it, next to a nature reserve. That made me conscious of the land and farming. I wasn't a rural family, but I was conscious of rural issues. I was very conscious of the fact that at that time, the world was starving. We had mass famines in both China and India all the time, and I really felt that we should be growing more food. I said, I wanted to dedicate my life to finding better ways to feed the world. And I read 3 books by a very famous Pulitzer Prize winning author, Louis Bromfield, who wrote a famous book called The Rains Came and was turned into a couple of blockbuster movies, one starring Lana Turner and Richard Burton. And the books were called Pleasant Valley, Malabar Farm and Out of the Earth. And they gave a picture of, back then, of what we would now call sustainable and regenerative agriculture then. I was also exposed to the work of Rudolf Steiner, and who created the concept of biodynamic agriculture, feeding the world without putting poisons in it or even inorganic fertilizers. But the world had been reacting to the fact that just as von Liebig had invented artificial fertilizers in 1840 and John Bennett Laws had invented superphosphate in 1842, and so every nutrient for the plant now came out of a bag, and we added poisons to that to get rid of the insects and the species that we didn't want. But I was so stimulated I wanted to study agricultural science, and I did. I went to Sydney University and studied agricultural science and majored in both plant physiology and soil science because I wanted to become a part of that revolution of feeding the world. That was my ambition, but also to do it in a world that kept the world undestroyed. I was even conscious then a bit, because I'd read Rudolf Steiner and Louis Bromfield, that people could actually destroy the earth while they were producing food. My teachers at Sydney University laughed at all these ideas, and I just kept them in my heart and went on because they were wedded to the so-called Green Revolution, initiated by one Norman Borlaug, a big American producer, and he produced this beautiful pattern for feeding the world with lots of pesticides and lots of nitrogen fertilizer coming from fossil fuel. That was the time. So, but I graduated from Sydney University and I was lucky enough to win a scholarship called the William Farrer Memorial Scholarship, named after our most famous wheat breeder, to take me somewhere. And I chose between Cambridge and Cornell in the US. And after a lot of thought, I went to Cornell.
So what year was this?
1960. So I went to Cornell and I loved the place, full of incredibly brilliant people. It was in upstate New York in a rural community again. And I studied under a man by the name of Arthur Gibbs, and studied the carbon chemistry of photosynthesis. So I was really interested in carbon, which later in life proved to be very useful when I was trying to study climate change and those big issues.
So you're moving from issues of agriculture more to biology?
Both biology and agriculture, because at that stage there were no environmental sciences anywhere formally called that, because we hadn't actually thought about the environment in a scientific way much. So productive agriculture was the nearest thing you could do to get, for example, an environmental degree. They did not exist. After all, there were no environment departments either. So, but I was still that kind of person because I'd read those books early in life when I was a teenager. So I went to Cornell and I met, amongst other things, a beautiful woman who I married, whose name was Kay, and her father was the vice president of New Yorker magazine, and she lived in Connecticut, and we were spending 1 week down there, and her father came in to me and said, Peter, have a look at these scripts. We're publishing this book, and this book had been rejected by many publishers as unscientific. Give us your opinion on it. And I read it and I went, wow, please publish it. And that book was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It was published in The New Yorker in 3 episodes. And that was also a reaffirmation of what I'd been believing. We were poisoning the earth by spraying pesticide on landscapes to kill, in this case, the so-called fire ant and a pile of other things. So that was a very verifying moment to this belief that I had inside me all this time, that somebody was affirming what I believed. And that was very exciting to me, and it consolidated my pathway from then on, actually, that particular moment. My time in America prepared me for coming back to working to Australia, to a world where I wanted to work in public policy, to make a world a better place, particularly in the environment and science, using my scientific knowledge to do that. And I came back after working briefly in the city of New York in a program called Model Cities, which was pioneered by Mayor John Lindsay at that time. And that gave my first instincts of urban public policy. I had not really, I'd worked in the natural public policy, but suddenly I was immersed in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, the poor areas, the black areas of New York, which were being uplifted by some enlightened policies at that time, which disappeared later on. It was a time of big moves even in America. So I worked in model cities, and that gave me a feeling that the social environment also mattered as well as the natural environment. That was the first time, and that prepared me when I came back to Australia.
And this is interesting, isn't it? The issues of agriculture, environment, urban policy are all kind of considered within the same realm in the late 60s, aren't they? Which is something we've lost in a way.
That's, yeah, and that was very big, because that was the vision that the Whitlam government started.
Would bring, yeah.
So I came back to Canberra, and my parents...
Yes, tell us about, you come back to Australia in December 1969.
That's correct. I came back to Australia, and in early 1970, I was exposed to told about a position in the Legislative Research Service in the Parliamentary Library. They wanted a specialist in science, technology and the environment, which my perfect job. I could really accept it. My goodness me.
Just to step back for a moment, just to compare the context of environmental public policy in Australia in 1970 compared to the United States. We were
way behind. We had one minister, Jack Beale, who was really a minister of pollution control, and we had the National Park Service and Wildlife Service in Sydney. That was it. No environment ministers, no environment departments anywhere to speak of. In the Parliament, there were a couple of committees, the Senate Committee on Water Pollution and the House of Representatives Committee on Wildlife Conservation, to which I contributed later on. But I came back, and Alan Fleming was the critical man there. He was the parliamentary librarian, later national librarian. He was a very enlightened, visionary man, very impressive man. He asked me to come to his office when I expressed an interest in the job, and he gave me the job on the spot. He said, "We need you to start next week, because members of Parliament are coming back and they're asking questions which you can provide with the answers." And no one else in this place, which was mostly economists and foreign policy specialists and those sorts of people were there. They didn't know what I knew. So he needed to uplift the capacity of the parliamentary library to be an expert in these new emerging areas of science-determined public policy and environmental public policy. That was a very enlightened decision at that time.
What about in the universities? Was there much in the way of environmental science programs?
No, really not much. They came a few years later, particularly at the ANU and a few other places, but it wasn't quite there. There was really no environment departments of any speaking at all. We had the State Pollution Control Commission in Sydney, which was all about dirty water and dirty air. They didn't think about land use at all. It was industrial sort of science that had no tie with the use of how land was used or any of those other issues which are now part of environmental public policy. So I came back and I got the job, and the second day I had my first client, and that was Tom Uren, who had just been given the job of environmental spokesman for the Labor Party by Gough Whitlam. And he had searched around trying to find somebody who knew anything about it. And he asked one of the librarians upstairs, and they said, "Well, we've got this big guy, Peter Ellyard, down here who's just started work yesterday. Would you like to talk to him?" He came down. And we started off a relationship which changed both his and my life. He couldn't find anyone else, so I was, to start with, his sole supporting person. He had other people who were working with him, Max Neutzer and Tat Troy in the urban area, and John Mant briefly too, who was still in Sydney, based in Sydney. But they were interested in the urbanism area, and he had a very big view. I started talking to him about other great ideas, and I introduced him to the ideas of Barry Commoner, who was a prime ecologist at Washington University in St. Louis, and I had read all his stuff. And he talked about the 3 laws of ecology. Everything is connected to everything else. Everything must go somewhere, and there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And we started with Tom. He had a better view than Barry Commoner. He saw the social environment and the urban environment as part of interconnected to everything else. Now that was him, because he'd been talking to Max Neutzer and Pat Troy. And I had my exposure in model cities in New York, so I knew where he's coming from. I hadn't quite adopted that myself yet, but I understood the need for a holistic public policy about the 3 elements: culture, society, natural science, and then also economics. Okay, the 4 big things: the economic, social, cultural, and so on. So that was where we started. And we crafted these policies together around the concept of the national estate, which had come from President John Kennedy. And he talked about that. He didn't define the national estate. Tom loved that phrase. And Tom was a very big-hearted person. He knew what he wanted to know. I spent my whole working life with him, giving him the details. It was like he had the gun, so to speak, but I was making the bullets for him, the ideas bullets to fill out his landscapes, conceptual landscapes. That's what I did for him, and we did that together. We both grew as a result.
Tell us a bit about what he meant and what you meant by this idea of national estate. It was quite elastic in a way, wasn't it?
Basically, it was anything worth keeping, you know, and that could be a heritage building, that could be a rainforest, or so on, okay? And that was really the whole, it could be anything. If it was worth keeping and saving, we should serve, and we should make the world compatible with that. In other words, we shouldn't have the new and the old with no connection between them. There should be a seamless connection between the new and the old. So the national estate was the precious things of the past. Now this is the birth of postmodernism, because throwing out, keeping old buildings, for example, in the modernist era involved demolishing them and replacing them with something else. Okay, but suddenly we wanted to retrofit buildings and putting new wiring and new rooms inside, but keeping the structure of the building. We say we updated and progressed. That was classically postmodernism, and that was a major emerging thing at that day.
This is not a term you used at the time, was it?
No, not at all. That was a reflective concept. But you see, at that time, in 1970, Joni Mitchell wrote her famous song, "They paved paradise and put a parking lot. Don't you know you don't know what's it's gone, lost till it's gone." That sort of thing. And then we changed our words. I noticed this at this time, but I actually, with retrospect, it became, swamps became wetlands, jungles became rainforests, and slums became heritage precincts. Right then, people started using heritage at that time. 2 or 3 years earlier, they were talking about slums, and they were talking about swamps, which we drain, not wetlands, which we keep and preserve. So this is a very holistic moment, and our word usage was a very big picture. So I became aware of some of that, but with hindsight of the 50 years that gone since, I've understood in a much deeper way what was going on then. I worked with Tom Uren largely, and also with Race Matthews, who was the private secretary to Gough Whitlam, who was very on side, to prepare policies on things like Lake Pedder and Kakadu and the Great Barrier Reef and the Cooloola Sandmass and Fraser Island. Yes. All those things were part of the policies, but also protection of wildlife. I worked with Lionel Murphy on using international treaties, because I told Lionel Murphy about the 1971 Ramsar Convention on Waterbirds, and the Ramsar Convention was really the first global environment related to land. There were a few in the oceans, but not many on the land at that time. And the Ramsar Convention was used later by Murphy and Whitlam and Uren and others to protect water, conserve water. So that allowed us to get into the Murray-Darling, for example, because of the Macquarie wetlands and all the wetlands of the Murray-Darling, because we had no say in the state rights issue of the time, other than cracking heads of state governments together. All that learning was embedded in a few people in the Whitlam government. Pat Troy was still there, John Mant was there, David Yinkin was there, and so there were a few people around. David Yinkin was not in the bureaucracy. He was a businessman. He came up from Melbourne and spent time with us. So that was what happened then. And there was a small coterie of people and 4 or 5 ministers who prepared the Whitlam government for office. One of the important things we did was we went to the OECD in Paris at one stage, having gone via Nixon's America. We went to the CEQ and the Council of Environment, and went to Canada. That was the first Environment Ministers' Conference ever in the OECD history.
Late 1974, I think this was.
1974, yes. And I wrote this speech of Moss with him, not for him, I started it, but we wrote it together, which turned out to be a very important speech because in it he gave the first view of environmental intergenerational equity. He said something like, we have not received the natural environment from our parents to do with what we think we can. We have borrowed it from our children and we must hold it in trust for them. That concept was totally new. It's a bit started to think about it. And it turned out to be the first utterance about intergenerational equity in terms of environment, which is now becoming, even today, now just emerging as a major whole area of public policy in sustainable economics and intergenerational. So we now not only have intragenerational equity, we must have intergenerational equity equally, and they both matter. And the courts are going to decide now a lot because with something we do on climate change is going to affect the climate down the road and the future generations. This is now really a big matter. And Moss was formerly credited as being the pioneer of intergenerational equity in the global world because I helped make sure that happened because I thought he needed the recognition. He got it, which he totally deserved. And Moss was a very competent minister, and I think when he went on to become Minister for Media with the changes in government, and Jim Cairns became the Minister for the Environment, he went on proudly because having achieved a lot in just 2 years as Minister. Jim Cairns stayed and went too because he had problems with, he'd been removed as Treasurer by Whitlam, yes. But he then socked Whitlam by asking for the environment portfolio. He said, I'm green inside. He showed that later on when he set up all those down-to-earth festivals around Australia after he finished in his world of politics. But he really cared about the environment. One of the important things he did was he organised money to be spent on state-based conservation organisations. He wanted to grow the environment movement outside, and the only group being funded at that time was Australian Conservation Foundation. Cairns, because of his relationship with the Treasury, could organise more money to go to the other areas of conservation, particularly the nature-based states conservation councils, which was one in every state. They still exist today. He helped them grow that movement into a permanent piece of the natural environment infrastructure lobby groups. At that time, the ACF brought their first person lobbyist to Canberra. And that was one woman by the name of Penny Figures, who is still around as a major environmental person today. And that was a very significant moment for creating the first part of a community lobby group for the environment. I think Cairns' biggest moment was he championed that bit. How do I make, after we've gone from government, how can we make sure the environment's protected by arming, giving the resources and growing the environmental movement outside, so they didn't have to do it on the smell of an oily rag, basically.
Just want to ask you about some more technical aspects, I guess, of what the department did as well. There was a real experimentation with new kinds of policy instruments. Many of those instruments we still try and use today in terms of environmental governance, things like impact statements, things like national environmental standards, things like polluter pay principles, forms of tax crediting for non-polluting instruments. Just describe how these kinds of mechanisms and instruments came onto the policy platform and how they were received within Cabinet.
Well, all of them were received, but not without a fair bit of debate, because the world was not ready for some of those ideas, and that included some members of the cabinet who were worried about them not being unpopular. Corporate Australia was not very supportive of most of them at that time, and they didn't like the idea of having to write impact statements at all, or they didn't even appreciate me having emission standards or any other kind of national standards at all. They said that we'd done well without them to do as we like, and that was a laissez-faire world. And so all those things were put in place, and that was probably as far as we could go at the time. I don't think we could have done much more than that. Yes. But my own thinking was that forcing compliance, again, by unwilling people is not going to really solve the problems, because people will be dedicated to minimising what they do or even avoiding what they do by some loophole or other thing. So we needed a deeper cultural change where people saw their environmental responsibilities equal to their financial responsibilities. In other words, you're a responsible leader or manager of an organisation of any kind. You know, not only have to be financially responsible, you should be ecologically and socially responsible too. This was not foreign country to most people. They said the economics is the only thing. Modernist economists didn't believe in things called externalities, and that those saw externalities were the natural environment and the social environment and human rights amongst these things, whereas they saw outside economic frameworks. And this was a very important recognition of the fact that we forced compliance on a group of people when the economic theories at the time and the general public understanding of these issues was much less. And we would have to wait for years for the cultural shifts to do those things now. Today we have all sorts of corporate entities talking about being on the front edge of the climate change debate, yes, helping make the planet. Unheard of in those days. You didn't. So corporate Australia and the world outside has changed to recognise the environment's part of what humans should do to protect their world for future generations. The sorts of things we did, things like the Heritage Commission, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and all the things we did, yes, in government.
Yes. I was going to say, a lot of things were achieved in these years, things like, you say, national parks legislation, protection of the Great Barrier Reef, creating the Australian Heritage Commission, various international agreements, the water policy in the Murray-Darling Basin as well, important. Something else we're still trying to work on today. Just reflect, I guess, on some of those achievements and their legacies today.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the water policy one, because there was one moment when we all went to Albury-Wodonga to set up the Albury-Wodonga Development Corporation. There was this big meeting with Tommy Wren and Bob Lounsey, who was the head of the DIRD, and Peter Walensky and John Mann and I were there. We were three people who were forming all this stuff, and we got what we wanted with Hamer and Lewis, the premiers of Victoria and New South Wales, agreeing to that. And South Australia wasn't there for some reason. I don't know why, but it wasn't, because they were on side anyway. Don Dunstan was totally on side. And but then after it was over, we were having lunch, and Gough Whitlam came up to me. He didn't do this very often, but I've never forgotten this. He was very excited. He said, "Peter, we need to fix up the Murray-Darling. How can we do it?" I said, "Well, the Waterbird Treaty will help, because that means we protect the wetlands.
The Ramsar Convention.
But we really have to get on the good side of the states, because they can be, if they want to be recalcitrant, they can be." Well, I went away and we spent the rest of our time in government trying to do that, but we got nowhere because the National Party were absolutely resistant. They wanted to take all the water and put it into cotton farms, into rice farms, and as far as they can see, we could have a dry river, no problems. The fact that South Australia was on the receiving end didn't seem to worry them too much. And of course the National Party just barely exists in South Australia, so they had no clout in the National Party room at the time. So we didn't get anywhere. But Whitlam had a vision of saying, we're going to fix up the entire Murray-Darling system using this one power, the Waterbird Convention power, the Ramsar Convention power, plus trying to get the goodwill of the states to help us do it. But it was a recalcitrant world, and of course, as we know, it's still not fixed today, because there's a lot of people who see this as a conflict between environment and development, and we certainly have created too much water-based agriculture there. We need to probably shrink that back a bit, and particularly as the climate's probably going to warm. And we actually need now to actually think about what's the right balance between protecting the river so it can be there in perpetuity and recognising the fact that this is the major food bowl of Australia. That's their facts of life. And that's a complex issue, and of course it requires a lot of complexity. So it's 50 years after the Whitlam government. That meeting, to my knowledge, was the first time anybody in federal government talked about fixing up the Murray-Darling. The coalition governments in the Menzies era and so on weren't interested. They said it's just there and it's a states' rights issue. They didn't actually see it as a national policy at all. So it's been a difficult road, and it still is a difficult road today. But Whitlam was the first person who actually said it, and he said it to me, so I felt very lucky, and I want to recite that piece of history and make sure it's on the records, because I don't know anyone else who's actually recorded, because there's only two people at that meeting, Whitlam and me, and John Mant was there too. There were three of us at that moment to have that conversation. So I really want to say that conversation really matters in terms of what's happening today in the Murray-Darling.
One of the great legacies of the Whitlam era was this innovating with new kinds of expert commissions to intervene in policy areas. The Australian holistic. The Australian Heritage Commission is perhaps the one we remember most. But there was also this thing called that Hawke continued this tradition in a way, creating this body called the Commission for the Future, which, as you say, you became...
I became the CEO of in 1989.
1989. Just tell us a bit about that entity, the Commission for the Future, and how it kind of continued on that legacy of national estate thinking.
Well, it did. The first thing I did was I restructured. It had been set up and headed by the Hawke government and by Barry Jones, who became minister, and headed by Rhonda Galbally, who was another friend of mine, who subsequently left there to become head of Vic Health, the Health Promotion Foundation of Victoria. And I took her place. I was invited to take her place and to fill her shoes. But I thought we needed to change that. So I created a series of futures, one called Sustainable Futures, Enterprising Futures, Asia-Australian Futures, which is a very important one about our relationship with Asia. And that became Asia Link in the University of Melbourne under Jenny McGregor, who was still there. Now, Jenny McGregor came into my office, I'll tell you this story, and she said, I don't know anything about Asia. Why should you appoint me? He said, Jenny, you're wonderful, but you are also don't know anything about Asia. That's like Australia. So as you go up the learning curve, you can take the whole organisation with you. And
the whole country with you, yeah.
The whole country, and she did precisely that to a wonderful degree. John Howard said, having a commission for the future is ridiculous. It's like having a commission for the past. And my response was, well, we do have one. It's called the Australian Heritage Commission. And I helped set that one up too. Because I actually was involved working with Barry Jones too on the Commission for the Future. Early stages, before I even became the head of it, I was part of a group of people who had the idea. And Barry and Philip Adams, the chairman, and the Hawke government bought the whole idea of having an organisation that took a long-term view of public policy. In other words, not next year, but 10 and 15 years ahead. It's a bit like the intergenerational report is today. Yes. In matter of fact, it would be better than the intergenerational report today. It's an organisation that gave intergenerational concepts across the board in a continuous framework. We should have one of those today in our...
Rather than a single report every 5 years, which we have now.
They can issue a 5-year report, but they should be there to advocate long-term planning. Yes. To say, climate change is going to hit us badly in 10 years, we have to do something now. And provide the long-term trajectories. So environment was becoming futures. They were becoming inseparable, okay? Now, I look back on my own career and say, well, I ran the environment department, and then I ran the futures department. And I constantly became a futurist because I said, I need even a bigger slate of integrative tools than I had with the national estate. With the futures, I can talk about anything. I can talk about the economy, I can talk about the climate, I can talk about ecology, I can talk about culture, I can talk about nature, I can talk about anything I like. So my learning from the Whitlam government all those years ago led me to that point, because all along the way I was trying to integrate public policy into holistic thinking around whole of government activities, not just individual departments and ministers. And I still think that's There should be a narrative about every government, which is a big narrative about the future. Some governments do it well, some governments don't do it at all. I'll leave you to judge who does it well and who does it badly. So future narratives are a very important part of shaping futures. And I've spent the last 20 years writing books and talking about creating public policies and concepts for integrating all these things through into a single holistic framework. And they're all in my new book, which published last March, called The Future Knowledge Compendium, A Curriculum for Thriving in the 21st Century. Now, that book couldn't have been written without this entire life story, which I've been telling you about, of which people like Tom Uren and Gough Whitlam and people like that were central to the ideas.
A final question then. We in a way, the problems that we inherit today are problems that we've been aware of and trying to solve for 50 years, since the early 70s at least. Many of the ways in which the Whitlam government and others framed them were the same kind of problems we're trying to solve. Many would see that as a story of lament and of failure or of defeat, but what you're saying is there's actually a much more positive spin to this, and perhaps to solve these problems do take a long time. Is that how you...
And hope.
And hope. Is that how you see this playing out?
You're either driven by fear or hope. I think that too many people are driven by fear. And they say, oh my God, the world's going to end, artificial intelligence is going to take us over. Rather than hope, so how can we use artificial intelligence to increase humans' capacity to live a better and more livable life? So in other words, I'm a futurist for a reason. You wouldn't want to hire a pessimistic futurist. There's no jobs for them. The market doesn't want them. I'm by nature an optimist, so my journey has been about optimising food production, clean food production, then in protecting environments, in protecting society, and now thinking about the entire planet. So my life journey has been about those things. And the Whitlam government, I was blessed to serve in that government because of one man's choice to pick me for that job back in 1970. I cannot tell you how grateful it is, because my own journey would not have been possible without him picking me out as a new arrival back from America after 10 years away, saying, I want a job, can I work with you? He said, yes. That's pretty nice.